LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup, the December 6th edition. Thanks for joining me. I've picked out 29 of the weekend's best clips for what should be another informative show, I hope, for you all tonight. As usual, my clips come mostly from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States. I'll also have a couple political comedy clips from Saturday Night Live, even though it was, again, not a very comedic week. I basically have three topics I'll be covering. The main topic that sort of seeps into both the other two topics is this shooting in San Bernardino, California, that looks like it was ISIS-inspired terrorism, but not really directed. At least that's the state of things right now. The two other topics are the Democratic side and the Republican side of the 2016 presidential race. A lot of the what people are saying about, or a lot of the clips in those two topics will be on the main topic of the San Bernardino shooting, but there'll be a few other things. I'll have some Hillary Clinton clips, some Bernie Sanders clips, some Donald Trump clips, Marco Rubio. If you look down in the video description, you can see all the topics listed and slightly more detail. And if you're watching this as a recorded show, you should see time indexes down there, so you can skip between the topics if that's how you want to watch the show. I've also put a link down to this clip list that I use. This is all 29 clips, including the two Barack Obama clips that I took right from his speech that was just about an hour ago. And that's what I'm going to start the show with, is the breaking news of President Obama's speech from the Oval Office talking about the threat of ISIS and both how the threat has changed. That'll be basically what I'm talking about in the first clip, and then some, even though he's not really changing his strategy, he's always reassessing, and there are certain steps that he wants to take. But the first clip I want to show you is President Obama talking about how the threat from ISIS has kind of morphed from what we saw with Al-Qaeda in 9/11 to this sort of homegrown, terrorist-inspired acts that look more like mass shootings. And one of the interesting parts about this clip is that included in those terrorist incidents, he mentions the Chattanooga shooting, which was the racist shooting of that black church in Chattanooga. And anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after you see that clip here.
Has been at war with terrorists since Al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 Americans on 9/11. In the process, we've hardened our defenses, from airports to financial centers to other critical infrastructure. Intelligence and law enforcement agencies have disrupted countless plots here and overseas and worked around the clock to keep us safe. Our military and counterterrorism professionals have relentlessly pursued terrorist networks overseas, disrupting safe havens in several different countries, killing Osama bin Laden, and decimating Al-Qaeda's leadership. Over the last few years, however, the terrorist threat has evolved into a new phase. As we've become better at preventing complex, multifaceted attacks like 9/11, terrorists turn to less complicated acts of violence like the mass shootings that are all too common in our society. It is this type of attack that we saw at Fort Hood in 2009, in Chattanooga earlier this year, and now in San Bernardino. And as groups like ISIL grew stronger amidst the chaos of war in Iraq and then Syria, and as the internet erases the distance between countries, we see growing efforts by terrorists to poison the minds of people like the Boston Marathon bombers and the San Bernardino killers. For 7 years.
So I'm not going to show you the majority of President Obama's speech. He did definitely call this terrorism and ISIS-inspired, and you saw there how he talked about the way in which the threat has morphed from the Al-Qaeda 9/11 style attacks to these terrorist attacks that are much more similar to our mass shootings, and he included the Chattanooga shooting in that list, which you'll see I have a couple clips from Attorney General Loretta Lynch from the Sunday morning shows this morning, and she also included Chattanooga in the list. That's something I noticed that she said that got brought into the president's speech. Before I get to that coverage from this morning, I do want to show one more clip from the president's Oval Office address that just finished about an hour ago. In this clip, he talks about how he's reassessing his strategy, or the United States strategy, how he's willing to look at changes in our visa program. First, he talks about the K-1 fiancé visa that this woman in San Bernardino apparently used to get from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia into the United States as the fiancé of an American. Then he also talks about changes in our gun laws. And then he goes back to the visa program. This is the visa waiver program for people coming from European countries. And I think I heard 38 countries have visa waiver programs. And then at the very end, he talks about what he's not going to do in changing his strategy, which is no massive U.S. ground troops, which is what a lot of Republicans have called for. And anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after you see that explanation of reassessing strategy, but not really changing strategy from President Obama tonight here.
Examine our strategy to determine when additional steps are needed to get the job done. That's why I've ordered the Departments of State and Homeland Security to review the visa waiver program under which the female terrorist in San Bernardino originally came to this country. And that's why I will urge high-tech and law enforcement leaders to make it harder for terrorists to use technology to escape from justice. Now, here at home, we have to work together to address the challenge. There are several steps that Congress should take right away. To begin with, Congress should act to make sure no one on a no-fly list is able to buy a gun. What could possibly be the argument for allowing a terrorist suspect to buy a semi-automatic weapon? This is a matter of national security. We also need to make it harder for people to buy powerful assault weapons, like the ones that were used in San Bernardino. I know there are some who reject any gun safety measures, but the fact is that our intelligence and law enforcement agencies, no matter how effective they are, cannot identify every would-be mass shooter, whether that individual is motivated by ISIL or some other hateful ideology. What we can do, and must do, is make it harder for them to kill. Next, we should put in place stronger screening for those who come to America without a visa so that we can take a hard look at whether they've traveled to war zones. And we're working with members of both parties in Congress to do exactly that. Finally, if Congress believes, as I do, that we are at war with ISIL, it should go ahead and vote to authorize the continued use of military force against these terrorists. For over a year, I have ordered our military to take thousands of airstrikes against ISIL targets. I think it's time for Congress to vote to demonstrate that the American people are united and committed to this fight. My fellow Americans, these are the steps that we can take together to defeat the terrorist threat. Let me now say a word about what we should not do. We should not be drawn once more into a long and costly ground war in Iraq or Syria. That's what groups like ISIL want. They know they can't defeat us on the battlefield. ISIL fighters were part of the insurgency that we faced in Iraq. But they also know that if we occupy foreign lands, they can maintain insurgencies for years, killing thousands of our troops, draining our resources, and using our presence to draw new recruits. The strategy that we are using now, airstrikes, special forces, and working with local forces who are fighting to regain control of their own country, that is how we'll achieve a more sustainable victory. And it won't require us.
So that's the second and last clip I wanted to show from President Obama's speech from the Oval Office tonight that finished a little over an hour ago. You see there that he was willing to reassess certain parts of his strategy, but was not really going to say he's changing strategy, and especially in that last part, most important part, in contrast to several of the Republicans, not all the Republicans, but several of the Republicans who want a much more robust American ground troop presence. I think President Obama is right there when he says that the United States sending in ground troops plays into ISIS's hands and doesn't really help the situation. And the gun law changes that he suggested seem to be fairly common sense. And I know I have some Second Amendment enthusiasts amongst my viewers who might disagree. And those visa changes also make sense. Those all seem like reasonable, small changes he could suggest without having to admit in any way that there's a failure of his strategy in fighting ISIS and terrorism. But I now want to move on to some of the analysis, and the first one is from Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update. I always try to start with political comedy clips, and this is what I had set to start with before I realized I needed to take a couple clips of President Obama's speech from the Oval Office. This is Saturday Night Live trying to take on a pretty difficult task of making comedy out of the San Bernardino shooting. They start off talking about the New York Times front page editorial about guns, and they kind of make fun of the Republican response on guns, but then they go on to sort of adopt some Republican talking points in making fun of President Obama's response, as I will discuss after you watch that clip over here.
The New York Times ran a front-page editorial urging Congress to take action following Wednesday's shooting in California. But Congress already took action because on Thursday, the Senate confronted the gun issue head-on by voting to defund Planned Parenthood. Good job, dudes. There have been more mass shootings in the U.S. this year than there have been days in the year. So how is defunding Planned Parenthood the priority right now? It would be like if you called an exterminator and he goes, whoa, you got a lot of rats in here, man. So the first thing we got to do is defund Planned Parenthood.
And it's not just Congress. On Wednesday, President Obama said that ISIS does not pose an existential threat to America. First of all, you can't use big words like existential. We're not in a philosophy class. We're a country that's about to be 4 deep into the Chipmunks franchise. We still think existential is a male enhancement pill they sell at gas stations.
So for our sake, President Obama, never imply that ISIS isn't a threat. Even if it's true, don't jinx it, all right? You sound less like the black president and more like the black guy in a horror movie. Hey, don't worry about ISIS. You white kids stay here. I'm gonna go check on that ruckus in the basement.
Sorry, I'm having some sort of weird audio interference in the background from my answering machine. I apologize for that. Hopefully it will cut off. I don't know what that is, but I do want to say that I thought that was, I don't know, kind of a mediocre analysis of both the gun issue and President Obama's reaction to the San Bernardino shooting. I didn't think that Saturday Night Live did that great a job on either part, and they brought up this whole point, this criticism of President Obama for saying that ISIS is not an existential threat. It's like we should get mad that people don't know what the word existential means, that it means that ISIS isn't a threat to the existence of the United States, which seems a pretty obvious fact, but you'll see a little later that those talking points will be taken up by one of the Republicans that I'm going to show a clip from a little later. But first, I want to show the clip. This is how Fox News Sunday previewed what the president was going to say in the speech that I already showed you those 2 clips from. And this is their reporter, Kevin Corke, who also talks about how the president was slow to call this attack terrorism. I guess he waited for the facts to come in, which was too much for Fox News, apparently, as I will discuss after you watch that 90-second report from Fox News reporter Kevin Corke here.
First time in over 5 years, the president will address the nation from the Oval Office. That address, we're told, could last about 20 minutes, and we're told by officials that he simply wants to reassure the American people that their safety and security remain his top priority. Now, we expect the president to highlight increasing security cooperation among agencies here and abroad, and of course, he'll once again call for what he likes to call sensible gun reform legislation. And we got a bit of a tip of the hand on that in listening to his weekly address.
Right now, people on the no-fly list can walk into a store and buy a gun. That's insane. If you're too dangerous to board a plane, you're too dangerous by definition to buy a gun.
No surprise, the New York Times walking in step with the White House on this, writing in an editorial, it is not necessary to debate the peculiar wording of the Second Amendment. No right is unlimited and immune from reasonable regulation. Meanwhile, the president's national security team convened in the Situation Room yesterday, breaking down, of course, the very latest intelligence on the attack, though the White House in a statement said that they, quote, as of yet uncovered no indication the killers were part of an organized group or formed part of a broader terrorist cell, although ISIS is now claiming that the two is operating in support of their group. What is less clear, however, Chris, is why it took the White House, for example, so much longer than the FBI to determine that this was, in fact, a terrorist act. We could learn a lot more about that tonight. Chris?
Kevin Corke reporting from the...
I guess if you watch the president's speech, we didn't really learn a lot more about why it was that President Obama's statements, when all the facts weren't quite in yet, did not come ahead of the FBI statements as the facts developed. You know, there was, I don't know how many of you watched this as it developed on cable news over several days, but there was this one news conference about 48 hours in, I think, where the FBI agent on the scene said, we are treating this as a terrorism investigation, and there was quite a while where they were going back and forth between workplace violence and terrorism, although it actually seems to be something of a blend, and I'll get to that when I show the various news reports from the corporate media news stations about the San Bernardino attack. But first I want to show a couple more clips from Fox News Sunday, where the host Chris Wallace brought on the Republican chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, Mike McCaul, to basically attack President Obama and his reaction on terrorism. First, you'll see Chris Wallace ask a fairly easy question, what I call a tee-up question instead of a confrontational versus question. If you read the little notes on that I use for my clips, most of the questions are either categorized as versus questions or tease questions, and this is where the host has teed up an easy softball question for the Republican, since it's Fox News Sunday. That's not too hard to believe, and it's how has President Obama reacted? Well, he's been slow to call it terrorism, apparently, which is what Mike McCaul said on Fox News Sunday, talking to Chris Wallace this morning here.
What have you thought of President Obama's response so far to the San Bernardino attack, and what would you like to hear him say in his speech to the nation tonight?
Well, first, he seemed to indicate that, going back to the fact that this could be an act of workplace violence, he has to get off this rhetoric. Make no mistake, this is not workplace violence. It's an act of terrorism. And these occurrences are happening too frequently. I think the tentacles of ISIS now are not only in Europe, but also in the United States of America. And the FBI stats show that. We have 70 ISIS-related arrests, more than one per week. 1,000 investigations in all 50 states. I wanted to tell the truth to the American people about what the threat nature really is and what the threat itself is, and that's radical Islamist terrorism. It does exist in the United States. We didn't see this one coming. There were no warning signs or flags, and we need to do a better job identifying the signs of radicalization from within the United States. We also need to stop the foreign fighter from traveling overseas into the United States. Those are the two main threat vectors. And Chris, we're just not doing an adequate job to adequately protect the American people.
Let's turn.
And if that wasn't enough of a softball question for Chris Wallace to give the Republican chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, Mike McCaul, at the end of the interview, he came back to that answer and said, at the beginning of the interview, I asked you what you wanted to hear from President Obama, and you said the truth. Does that mean President Obama hasn't been telling the truth? Which, of course, is a total setup softball for a Republican. And Mike McCaul goes to these talking points I was talking about. First, the one you heard on Saturday Night Live about the existential threat. Like, you'll hear Mike McCaul say, he says that ISIS isn't a threat, or to quote him exactly, an existential threat, which is not the meaning of existential threat. And he also talks about this thing that President Obama said right before the Paris attack, that ISIS was contained, although, as I showed a few weeks back, the actual clip has President Obama talking about how they're geographically contained in Iraq and Syria. So both of the Republican talking points are kind of bogus, but Chris Wallace doesn't really follow up in any way, though I'm not really showing that, but just gives the softball to the Republican to make the anti-Obama talking points you can see right here.
I want to end where I began, because one of the things that struck me in your initial answer about what you want to hear from the president tonight is you said you want him to tell the truth. You don't think he's been telling the truth to the American people?
Well, before Paris, he said ISIS was contained. Before San Bernardino, he said that America was safe from ISIS, was not an existential threat, is what he said in his own words. He seems to want to downplay this threat all throughout his campaign narrative into his presidency. And I think the American people deserve to know what the truth really is. And we also want to hear from him a military strategy to finally defeat and destroy ISIS, drain the swamp so the swamp from Syria can't come into the United States. And San Bernardino is an example of the swamp coming to the United States.
Chairman McCaul, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Sorry about that. I was having a little problem with my autofocus there, and I would have been very blurry if I'd come back from the clip right away. So I apologize for that. But I pretty much described the clip before I showed it and what my criticisms were of the Republican talking points, especially at the end there about President Obama saying that ISIS was contained and about the whole existential threat thing that depends on people not knowing the meaning of existential threat. And so now I want to move on to the way the different corporate news programs reported on the San Bernardino shooting itself, starting with the report also from Fox News Sunday. This is their reporter, Will Carr, reporting from Redlands. It's actually fairly similar to the subsequent reports I'm going to show you. I think the one fact that's in this one that I didn't see in any of the others was that the person who provided the rifles to the couple in Redlands who allegedly committed this attack, that when his place was raided in Riverside, that was in several of the reports, but only in this report did they say that he may have checked himself into a mental health clinic or something like that. Anyway, I'll talk about that a little more if you watch this Fox News Sunday report from this morning on the latest on the shooting in San Bernardino here.
Chris, authorities are trying to figure out how these two suspected terrorists flew under the radar in this Southern California neighborhood. On Saturday, federal authorities raided a home in nearby Riverside, California. We're told the resident, Enrique Marquez, was a former neighbor of Syed, Farook, and Marquez may have legally purchased the semi-automatic weapons used in Wednesday's mass shooting. Authorities say Marquez has not been charged, and now there are reports he checked himself into a mental health facility. Now the focus of the federal terrorism investigation has shifted to Farook's wife, Tashfeen Malik, the 29-year-old mother who, along with Farook, collected a cache of weapons, ammunition, and IEDs inside of their apartment in Redlands. Some neighbors say they noticed a lot of suspicious activity in the couple's garage for the past couple of weeks, but did not call authorities because they did not want to racially profile. Federal authorities now say Malik pledged her allegiance to ISIS on Facebook the day of the shooting. And we're learning she may have been the one who radicalized Farook, and sources say she may have been the family bomb maker.
I think it's the female assailant at this point who may have actually been angling to marry someone with a clean record so that she could bring terrorism to the United States.
Malik was born and educated in Pakistan, spent time in Saudi Arabia. She met Farook online and came to the United States in 2014. She was granted her conditional green card this past July. And as the investigation continues, this community is remembering the 14 lives lost, and we'll be listening intently to the president's address. Chris.
Will Carr.
So that focus at the end on the woman, that's the other point I wanted to make that goes through all these news reports I'm going to show. that was definitely the theme that's been in most of the reporting in the morning, that the wife may have radicalized the husband. What's her name? Tashfeen Malik. And I don't know, one of the things I thought was kind of bogus about that report from Fox News Sunday that I didn't mention before I showed the clip was about 30 seconds from the end, there was that random expert who was not named, or, you know, they didn't put his name up and they didn't say who he was in the narration, but apparently he's some expert on maybe the wife radicalized the husband, because, I don't know, that's what everybody's saying in these news reports I'm going to show you, although most of the time they actually tell you who the person is who is talking, not just some random guy. I mean, maybe he is some big expert, but I have no idea who that guy was, and they never said on Fox News Sunday, which I thought was kind of bogus. But I want to move on now to the CBS report, which has some similar facts, but you'll see does something that would be like sacrilege over on Fox News Sunday, that they mention the fact that it is actually some type of workplace violence in addition to being a terrorist attack, that it may actually be a blend of the two. I think the reporter on CBS is Jeff Pergues. It's one or the other. You'll see when you watch that clip over here.
There are hundreds of investigators around the world running down leads. FBI Director James Comey met with the president on Saturday to brief him on this case. One lead took investigators to this Riverside, California home where a friend of one of the suspects lived, a man who investigators believe may have provided 2 of the assault rifles used in the attack. Freddie Escamilla is a neighbor.
When I found out that it was FBI, which I found pretty quickly, that's when I thought, oh man, this is serious.
Investigators are tracking Syed, Farook, and Tashfeen Malik's family, friends, and associates overseas and in the U.S. to determine if the couple's shooting massacre was directed by ISIS. So far, the FBI says there are indications of radicalization and potential inspiration. Sources say the attack on the Inland Regional Center appears to have been a blend. There were elements of a workplace grudge that appeared to trigger the attack, coupled with Malik's Facebook post of allegiance before the attack to the ISIS leader. Federal officials acknowledge that the shooting has now moved the global terrorist threat in the U.S. to a new phase. A government official says, "We are going to see more attacks. We can't stop." The FBI has about 900 cases across the country focusing on homegrown ISIS sympathizers. Still, these 2 suspects were not on their radar.
So as you could see from the Chiron that came up the end there, that was Jeff Pergues from CBS's Face the Nation, with a lot of the similar facts, and also this big concentration on Tashfeen Malik, the wife in this terrorist couple, although at least on CBS's Face the Nation, they talked about how there was some workplace violence blended into the ISIS terrorism part. And the next clip I'm going to show is ABC's Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas giving a somewhat similar report, but you'll see it's actually a lot more heavy on the facts, and I think there's some interesting facts that I will discuss after you watch that clip over here.
FBI investigation involving hundreds of agents is at full tilt as the law enforcement and intelligence community wrestles with a new unpredictable phase where a potentially deadly homegrown terror threat is growing.
The moment urgent. The President of the United States huddled with his top national security advisors in the wake of the San Bernardino massacre. While the FBI and White House are not yet ready to officially say the attack was inspired by ISIS, that is a growing concern after we learned the female member of the killer couple swore allegiance to the leader of ISIS. ISIS, meanwhile, seizing the moment, calling the killers supporters.
ISIL and other terrorist groups are actively encouraging people around the world and in our country to commit terrible acts of violence.
This morning, the race is on to find out more about the plot. The FBI continues to try to exploit phones and computers left behind by the suspects, even though they took great efforts to try to destroy evidence. Family, friends, and associates being interviewed with the Investigation International as the FBI focuses on trips abroad, including to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan.
So far, we have no indication that these killers are part of an organized larger group or form part of a cell.
But if this couple was truly inspired by ISIS, it marks a dangerous evolution in the U.S. terror threat. The FBI director has been warning for months about ISIS's unprecedented social media campaign, urging potentially thousands of followers here in the U.S. to attack.
It's as if a devil sits on someone's shoulder all day long saying, kill, kill, kill.
An ISIS-inspired attack narrowly averted in May when two men armed with assault rifles targeted a Texas cartoon conference about the Prophet Muhammad. In the last 2 years, the FBI has identified or arrested nearly 90 suspected ISIS supporters here at home. Average age only 25, at least 20 teenagers, 13 females. 15 of those arrested, accused of trying to launch murderous plots inside the U.S. And now possibly this couple, who left behind a 6-month-old baby to go on a vicious killing rampage.
George, it's not lost on anyone at the U.S. government got caught off guard and had no warning that a suburban couple had such lethal intentions. The FBI director has warned that the ISIS social media campaign has targeted a young audience of troubled people who are buying in. A lethal new dynamic that we're only beginning to understand, George.
And we'll hear more on that from the president tonight. Let's get more.
So that was the ABC report, and like I said, it had a whole bunch of facts and numbers that I thought were kind of interesting that you didn't see in the Fox News or the CBS report that I showed. Meet the Press didn't actually have a straight news report so much, but I do want to show a couple clips they had of the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch. She only appeared over on NBC's Meet the Press, and here's her response to sort of the softball question at the beginning from Chuck Todd about what's the state of the investigation. And this is some of the facts that you also heard in the president's speech tonight if you were listening to it, but if not, I didn't go through all the facts that were in the president's speech. This is what Loretta Lynch said in about a minute about that this morning here.
We are 4 days since the attack. What can you tell us this morning about the state of the investigation and what we know now?
Well, this investigation is ongoing. It's wide-ranging. It's very complex. Certainly, as you noted, we're 4 days away from these horrific attacks. Immediately, the FBI began working with our state and local counterparts, with whom we have an excellent relationship. This is an FBI investigation now because of the indications that we do have of radicalization. This is a terrorism investigation at this point in time, but we continue to work closely with our state and local counterparts. Also, ATF marshals are on the ground, and we're also really focusing on the victims of this horrific attack. 4 days, over 300 interviews, several locations searched, a lot of information being processed, being analyzed, and being gathered, and more to come. So what I would say to people is that this investigation, as it has already been stated, is a marathon and not a sprint, but it is one of great concern to the American people, and so we're committed to keeping people informed.
You say definitively this morning they were.
So that was the first clip of Attorney General Loretta Lynch I wanted to show you. And then the second clip, she's talking about the threat of homegrown terrorism and the changing threat from ISIS. And this is where she kind of previews what President Obama said, talking about these terrorist attacks that seem like mass shootings. And she includes Chattanooga in the list of terrorist attacks like the president did over in this clip.
It's that this indicates the evolving nature of the threat that we are seeing. We have come from a time of the large-scale planned al-Qaeda-style attacks to the encouragement of lone wolves, Fort Hood, Chattanooga, to the encouragement of people to act on their own.
But we've been hearing this for 6 years.
Yes.
That the threat has changed, and it looks like we've no new ways to stop this threat. I mean, do we have to just accept the idea that this is the way we have to live now? Accept the idea that a lone wolf inspired by an ISIS website could just mow people down?
I don't think we should ever accept the idea that someone can come along and take away our safety and our freedom. I think we have to do everything we can to prevent that. And that is really a multifaceted approach. We've evolved a lot since 9/11 also in terms of our law enforcement capabilities, our intelligence capabilities, military, counterterrorism. We have been watching this threat evolve for some time. We are now at a point where, because we in fact have been successful at stopping a number of plots, the threat has evolved. We do see these lone wolf actors newspapers, we do see these encouragements for troubled individuals to pick up a gun and act out of this ideology. Again, not sure which one they picked in this case, despite the media accounts, but we do see this. We have to evolve as well, and we are. We are reviewing everything about this case, but also past cases to see what are the common threads. And when we look back at the terrorism investigations since 9/11, and there have been numerous ones, one of the things that does come to the fore, Chuck, is that in a number of these cases, when we look back at these individuals, someone did notice a change. Someone did notice a substantive.
We're hearing that already from family members.
Change.
Everybody is now saying that. And so how do you get people to talk about that before it happens?
Yes. What we tell people is alert law enforcement. We are on alert 24/7, and everything that you report will be investigated. We do it in private. We do it covertly. This could be a problem. It could simply be your neighbor having a bad day. But better be safe than sorry.
Let me ask you about the NSA program that.
So that's the second clip of Attorney General Loretta Lynch, and like I said, it kind of mirrors, at least the beginning of that clip, mirrors what I showed from President Obama in the speech he finished an hour or so ago tonight from the Oval Office about how the threat has morphed, and it includes these mass shooting incidents and includes shootings like the one in Chattanooga, which was a white supremacist, racist inspired shooting of a black church, which is interesting for the Obama administration to include that with ISIS inspired attacks like apparently this one in San Bernardino. And the last clip I want to show on the specific topic of the San Bernardino shooting, before I get to the candidates on both the Democratic and the Republican side, who, like I said before, are also talking a lot about the San Bernardino shooting. But the last clip specifically on that is some reporting I saw later in the day, since I postponed my final clip list to wait for the president's speech. I happened to see this report on CNN's Newsroom with Poppy Harlow, I believe is the show. I didn't even have time to put the show in the video description. I will if you're watching this as a recorded show. But this is a report that kind of is in contrast to all those news reports I showed that said that the wife radicalized the husband, that Tashfeen Malik was the instigator and came from Pakistan. There was even that Fox News unnamed expert who said it may turn out that it's some sort of like a bride looking for someone with a clean record. Well, apparently, if you believe the father of the male shooter, Syed Farook, and that's actually his father's name too, he's saying that the father is a liberal Muslim, but that unfortunately Syed Farook was becoming a conservative Muslim, which is kind of an interesting use of the words liberal and conservative, I thought, and that Syed Farook, the husband, also had leanings towards ISIS that had been going back for years. And anyway, I'll show you that clip from CNN, like I said, Newsroom with Poppy Harlow, I think, and the reporter's name I hadn't seen before. Her name is Kyun Law, I think, something like that in this clip.
Oh, well, the father is telling reporters that he was a good kid, a quiet kid when he was growing up, but as an adult, increasingly more conservative and religious, and in the end, sharing an ideology with ISIS.
Sir, do you have a moment just to speak with us for a minute?
Syed Farook, father of gunman Syed Rizwan Farook, driving away from his home this morning. He's been speaking to reporters on and off, earlier saying he and his son were divided on ideology.
All Pakistanis coming from the major cities are liberal people.
Understood.
Okay. And he was going towards conservation.
He was going towards what?
The conservation. His views were conservative, my views were liberal.
Farook explains more of their divide in an extensive interview with Italian newspaper La Stampa. He says his son was shy, too conservative, and the father became angry when he once saw his son had bought a gun. The elder Farook saying about his son's beliefs, he said he shared the ideology of al-Baghdadi to create an Islamic state, and he was fixated on Israel. A Pakistan-based relative of Farook's who had met him in the U.S. tells CNN the gunman started following a stricter interpretation of Islam 3 to 4 years ago, and the whole family was worried about the shift in his character. The relative saying that change began before he met and married wife and fellow killer Tashfeen Malik. They would meet first over the internet. Farook seeking a religious woman. Friends say they eventually met in person in Saudi Arabia. Malik entered the U.S. last year on a fiancé visa. Investigators tell CNN Malik, under a different name, posted on Facebook a pledge of allegiance to ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi just before the massacre began.
So that is a much later story than most of the clips I showed. Like I said, it comes from this CNN program that came just an hour or so before the president's speech. So that is, in some cases, almost 12 hours after when the news programs are recorded. The Sunday morning news analysis shows from which I normally take my clips. But that's sort of a contrast to what I saw reported on almost all those morning shows about how the working theory was that Tashfeen Malik, the woman from Pakistan who also went to Saudi Arabia, that she was somehow the catalyst for the radicalization, that she radicalized her husband. That's some evidence that he had already been radicalized or had become a conservative Muslim rather than a liberal Muslim like his father, which as a liberal, I like that use of the word liberal versus conservative. But like I said, that's the last clip I want to show specifically on the San Bernardino shooting. But the next two topics of the Democratic and then the Republican side of the 2016 presidential race, like I said at the beginning, the San Bernardino shooting was also a topic that most of the candidates talked about, and that's certainly true of Senator Bernie Sanders, who was over on Face the Nation talking to John Dickerson, and John Dickerson asked him if he were president of the United States and giving this Oval Office address, what would he say about ISIS? And actually, what he said wasn't that different from what you hear from President Obama in the speech, but he did definitely emphasize the lessons learned from ground wars in the past, which I don't know if that's an oblique reference to Hillary Clinton having voted for the Iraq War. But anyway, here's Bernie Sanders saying how he would confront ISIS, and he tries to start off with strength, but also differentiate himself from the more militaristic positions that some of his opponents, even possibly his main Democratic opponent, take in this clip.
Senator Sanders, the president is going to address the nation tonight. If you were president, what would you say?
What I would say is that we have got to be as aggressive as we can in destroying ISIS, but we have to learn the lessons of the past. And that means we cannot do it alone. It must be an international coalition in which the Muslim nations are the troops on the ground. King Abdullah of Jordan, whose country has been playing a heroic role dealing with refugees and ISIS, made the point that it is the Muslim nations that are fighting for the soul of Islam who have got to lead the effort in crushing ISIS. The United States, the UK, France, Russia, Iran, other countries around the world have got to be supportive. But the troops on the ground have got to be Muslim nations. And I believe very strongly that we need to put that coalition together. We need to put it together as soon as possible. But I do believe we have got to learn the lessons from Iraq. I hear a lot of tough talk coming from my Republican opponents out there. They're really tough guys. But I heard that back in 2002 from George W. Bush. He was wrong. The invasion of Iraq was one of the worst foreign policy blunders in the history of this country, and in many ways precipitated exactly where we are today. So yes, we've got to be tough, but we have got to be smart. And that means an international coalition with Muslim troops on the ground supported by Western democracies with air power and other military efforts. But the troops on the ground to crush ISIS have got to be led by the Muslim nations.
That's the foreign policy piece. What's your feeling? What would your message be about America and the threat in the homeland security sphere of this conversation?
Obviously, we have got to do everything that we can to protect the American people. That's a no-brainer. And that means much tougher screening policies than we have right now. I think Secretary of Homeland Security Johnson is right. We should have more agents placed in other countries around the world. And it's not just Muslim countries that we have to worry about. There are other countries as well that people can slip into this country. Second of all, I think we need to do much, much better work, not only in our intelligence efforts, but in coordinating international intelligence. I think clearly Paris was an intelligence failure, and we need to be tapping the intelligence information that is being ascertained from countries all over the world.
Democrat.
So I think most of what Senator Bernie Sanders said there makes sense. I think his pronunciation of the word Muslim is a little funny. He keeps talking about the Muslim countries, but I guess that's just where he's from in New York. But the serious problem I have with what he's suggesting about the Muslim countries coming in to fight ISIS is that there are some difficulties there in using, to fight ISIS, which is a Sunni Muslim movement. You really need Sunni forces, and there are Sunni forces, although they haven't really contributed much in the way of ground troops. But the Sunni coalition includes like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and Egypt is also a Sunni nation, although they haven't contributed any troops. But the problem is that they're fighting ISIS in Iraq, and Iraq is now controlled by a Shia government, and they don't want the Sunni troops coming in to fight ISIS, but the Sunnis who live where ISIS is now, they don't want the Iraqi government Shias to come in there and fight ISIS either, because they think that if there's a Shia takeover of the Sunni areas of Iraq, that that's one of the big problems with the Iraqi government, is that it's not an inclusive government. It didn't bring in the Sunni minorities that are majorities out in the places where ISIS is. ISIS is a Sunni group, and it's doing well in the Sunni areas of Iraq because the Shia government did not include the Sunnis in some kind of coalition power sharing type thing. And that was the old Maliki government, and I don't know if that's going to be fixed politically, but that's the whole political problem. And it's not just the use of Muslim troops like Bernie Sanders was saying, but there's this whole diplomatic change that has to be instituted, where the Shia Iraqi government has to allow either Sunni forces or the indigenous Sunnis to fight ISIS in a way that gives more local control and more power sharing with the Sunnis who aren't ISIS. But anyway, that is a small concern I have with the way that Bernie Sanders framed the issue in that last answer. And now I'm going to move on to Hillary Clinton answering a fairly similar question about how she would, or that this is actually on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, talking to George Stephanopoulos, and he seems fixated on whether we should declare war on ISIS. But along the way, you'll see Hillary Clinton gives most of her answer about how she would deal with ISIS, and not much different from what you saw from Bernie Sanders in that last answer in this clip.
First time this presidential campaign, and a reminder for everyone watching, I worked for President Clinton, made charitable contributions in the past to the Clinton Foundation. Welcome back.
Thanks, George.
Is it time to declare war on ISIS?
Look, we are definitely in conflict with ISIS, and I think we need a new update of military authorization. The AUMF, which was passed after the attack on 9/11, should be brought up to...
Why not declare war?
Well, declare war is a very legal term, as you know so well. I think what we want to do is make sure we have every tool at our disposal to, number one, destroy their would-be caliphate in Syria and in Iraq. Number two, do everything we can to dismantle this very effective virtual jihadist network that they are using on the internet. And number three, do whatever is necessary to protect us here at home.
What are you concerned about in the declaration of war?
Well, I think that the legal experts say that there are a lot who say that we already have the authority we need to go after ISIS or any international terrorist network, including Al-Qaeda and anybody else. in the AUMF. I think it is important, though, for the Congress to vote on behalf of the American people and to make sure that we are updating it to take into account the new authorities at risk.
You've also been reluctant to say we're...
So, yeah, that was George Stephanopoulos fixating on the issue of declaring war versus what's an AUMF, an authorization of use of military force. And you actually heard in that clip I played from President Obama near the beginning that President Obama was asking Congress to update his authorization for use of military force so that Congress actually has a stake in the outcome and gives legal authority. Right now, President Obama is working on the basis of the authorization of use of military force that came after September 11th and the authorization for use of military force that came before the invasion of Iraq under George W. Bush. So it doesn't really completely fit. Some people say that it's an illegal war. I don't know. That's not the kind of thing that U.S. courts would really interfere in. It's more of a political question and the struggle between Congress and the president. Congress has to totally cut off funds and say no, no, no to war before there's any sort of legal basis for a court to step in. I mean, I don't want to go into all of that, but I want to move on to the next question that George Stephanopoulos asked Hillary Clinton about the difference between treating these types of attacks as a terrorism problem versus a gun problem, and Hillary Clinton tries to play it as both, which I think it actually is, but you can tell me what you think after you watch that. And it's actually a much more extensive discussion between George Stephanopoulos and Hillary Clinton about the no-fly lists, and that's important to pay attention to because I'm going to show several clips later from the Republicans where the Republicans are all of a sudden thinking that people on the no-fly list need more due process, but you'll hear kind of the opposite from Hillary Clinton, saying that the no-fly list already has due process after she talks about both guns and terrorism being issues to deal with after shootings like we saw this week in this clip.
I've also criticizing you for focusing on gun control after the San Bernardino attacks. Marco Rubio points out that France has some of the strictest gun control in the world. That didn't stop the Paris attacks. California has some of the strictest gun control laws here. It didn't stop those attacks either. So what law would have stopped this?
Well, first of all, what happened in San Bernardino was a terrorist act. Nobody is arguing with that. The law enforcement, FBI, have come to that conclusion. And let's not forget, though, a week before, we had an American assault on Planned Parenthood. And some weeks before that, we had an assault at a community college. So I don't see these two as in any way contradictory. We have to up our game against terrorists abroad and at home. And we have to take account of the fact that our gun laws and the easy access to those guns by people who shouldn't get them, mentally ill people, fugitives, felons, and the Congress continuing to refuse to prohibit people on the no-fly list from getting guns, which include a lot of, domestic and international terrorists. These are two parts of the same approach that I'm taking to make us safe. And yes, the NRA's position always is, if you can't stop everything, why try to stop anything? That's not the way law works. I mean, we have laws that are going to govern our speed limits on roads, knowing some people are going to violate it or people are going to drive drunk, but we still have laws. We need to have comprehensive background checks. We need to close the gun show loophole, close the online loophole, go after what's called the Charleston loophole, and end the liability for gun sellers.
On this no-fly list, the critics of that vote say that, you look back at this list, it's indiscriminate, and they go back 10 years and say 2,000 people on the watch list actually did buy guns. Government hasn't found any of them committing a crime with a gun.
Well, again, that's like proving the negative. We have a list. If you are on that list and you believe you should not be on that list, we have a process to actually raise your objections about being on that list. You get on the list because there is some credible evidence you belong on the list. Now, obviously, that
some mistakes sometimes.
Some mistakes, of course. That's why there's a process for people to be able to raise their concerns about being on the list, and then to have a process that could even lead to a legal action to remove yourself from the list. But I, for one, am a lot I took the shuttle from New York. I'm a lot happier having a list that keeps people off planes that there's any question about their intent or their potential behavior. So I can't take anybody seriously who's going to begin to chip away at the no-fly list.
Donald Trump and yesterday Jerry Falwell Jr. say the answer is for more good people to have guns. Mr. Falwell urged his students at Liberty University to actually arm themselves, get concealed carry permits. Your response?
Well, he also went on, and don't forget he said this, George. He said that way we can take out the Muslims. He said that, okay? This is the kind of deplorable, not only hateful response to a legitimate security issue, but it is giving aid and comfort to ISIS and other radical jihadists. With respect to the gun issue, it's legal to buy guns in America. If you are eligible to buy a gun, you can go buy a gun, and hundreds of thousands of people apparently are in the aftermath of what happened in San Bernardino. I just want people to understand some of the threats we now face, whether it's the guy in Charleston who should never have been given a gun, but the universal background check was not fast enough, didn't find the fact he was prohibited, went into the church and killed 9 innocent people. We should be able to approach both of these with some sense of, unity about how we prevent terrorist attacks and how we prevent the wrong people from getting a hold of guns.
Have to take a quick break, Stan.
So there's Hillary Clinton positioning herself in contrast to several Republicans I'll show in a minute on the no-fly list. Now, the problem for me, actually, is I think there are a lot of problems with the no-fly list. The ACLU has been fighting the no-fly list since the George W. Bush administration because people get on there who shouldn't be on there. And I am a little disturbed by having Hillary Clinton now say that the no-fly list has no problems, while a little bit later I'll show all these Republicans talk about the due process problems with the no-fly list that I, as a longtime ACLU member, have believed has been a problem for a long time. And I don't know why it's now on the Republicans, but that's just one of the weird things about civil liberties, that every now and then, even though I think the Democratic Party is generally more supportive of civil liberties than the Republican Party, every now and then there's a switcheroo and the Republicans become more supportive of some civil liberty, or in some specific case where it's politically, or it's a partisan advantage, which it is in this case, because it has to do with gun rights and the Second Amendment, as you'll see when I show those clips. But before I get to that, I have 2 more clips on the Democratic side, 1 more Hillary Clinton, and then to cleanse the palate for those who are Bernie Sanders fans, there's 1 more Bernie Sanders clip. But first, here's Hillary Clinton responding to an attack from Donald Trump that she doesn't have the energy and the strength to be president because she just shows up for a few minutes and then has to take a nap, or I can't remember exactly what it is that Donald Trump says in the clip that George Stephanopoulos shows, and then it gets into sort of a longer discussion between George Stephanopoulos and Hillary Clinton about why Donald Trump has been successful, and I don't know, he's still the front runner. This could be the actual Republican versus Democratic debate after the primaries, with Hillary Clinton is the front runner on the Democratic side talking about Donald Trump, who's the front runner on the Republican side, over in this clip.
Last few days he's opened up. You're laughing again.
I'm sorry, I can't help it.
He's opening up a new line of attack on you. Here it is.
Oh dear, a new one, huh?
She'll do a couple of minutes in Iowa, meaning a short period of time. And then she goes home. You don't see her for 5-6 days. She goes home. She goes to sleep. I'm telling you. She doesn't have the strength. She doesn't have the stamina.
Oh, goodness gracious.
I guess you don't agree.
Well, who can agree with anything he says that is, subject to 1 second of fact-checking? Look, if he gets the nomination, I will be more than happy to campaign against him.
Is he the one you want to run against?
I don't really think about it that way. I don't have any influence over who they nominate over there. And in fact, he's not the only one saying things that are deeply distressing. A lot of the others are kind of Trump too, whatever Trump says, maybe we won't go quite as far, but we'll get as close as we can. So the Republicans in their presidential nominating process have a lot to answer for.
How do you explain why he's doing so well?
I don't know, because he's a reality TV star. I mean, tens of millions of people have watched him for more than a decade on TV, and he's part of the celebrity culture. And he will say whatever he wants to say, and if he's held account that it's not true, he just brushes it off and he goes on. And I think that, there's a certain attractiveness to people that here's a guy who says exactly what he believes, untrue as it may be, inflammatory as it certainly is.
Finally, you said you're getting better.
So, I don't know. That's how Hillary Clinton is approaching the threat of Donald Trump, how we might see Hillary Clinton is the front runner on the Democratic side, Donald Trump is the front runner on the Republican side. So, if the front runner is indicative of who's going to be the eventual nominee, which may or may not be true, given that the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries are still about 2 months away, and there are a lot of things that could switch around, although I think the chances of Bernie Sanders overtaking Hillary Clinton are fading as foreign policy becomes more of the focus of the campaign, which is kind of a problem, I guess, and is kind of a problem for the last issue in the topic of the Democratic candidates that I want to address, the issue of climate change, which Bernie Sanders talked about in his interview over on Face of the Nation. Climate change might have been the big issue of the week since there was this big conference in Paris on the climate change issue, and apparently there's going to be an agreement. It didn't quite get finalized during the conference, but apparently it's going to be finalized in the coming weeks. But the Paris conference was overshadowed last week with news of, because the terrorist attacks in Paris had so recently happened, and I showed that in the couple clips I showed last week that were reporting on how the Paris Climate Conference was overshadowed by terrorism. And of course there's almost no reporting this week on the Paris Climate Conference. Here's Bernie Sanders saying something that supporting a policy that doesn't get talked about a lot, but is to the left of President Obama, and I think to the left of Hillary Clinton. The sad thing about fighting carbon and the carbon that causes climate change is that the Democratic position of President Obama and I believe Hillary Clinton is what's called cap and trade, which is actually an old Republican idea that tries to use the free market so that some people can pollute more by paying other people to pollute less. And the real way to take care of the carbon problem is to tax carbon so that it's a cost that, that's still using the market. But one of the problems with the free market is it doesn't take into account what's called externalities, which, if what you're making produces all this carbon that harms everyone, but that's not a part of what people pay when they buy your product, well, that's what a carbon tax does. It adds that cost to your product. And that's what Bernie Sanders is advocating in his, this is the last clip on the Democratic side of the 2016 presidential race, talking to John Dickerson on CBS's Face the Nation this morning here.
Climate change, I know that was an important issue for Democrats this week. You've got a new plan coming out. It has a carbon tax as a part of it. Might that not scare people who think they're...
Absolutely.
Tell me about that.
All right. Well, John, this is not a plan for Democrats. Pope Francis recently said something which I think is profound, and he's right, as he often is. And what he said is this planet is on a suicidal direction in terms of climate change. And it is beyond my comprehension that we can have a Republican Party and Republican candidates who are more concerned about getting huge campaign contributions from the Koch brothers and ExxonMobil and the coal industry than they are about accepting what the overwhelming majority of scientists are saying. And that is climate change is real, caused by human activity, and already causing major and devastating problems in our country and around the world. And what the scientists are telling us is if we do not act boldly and aggressively now, which is what my legislation does, massive cuts in carbon pollution. If we don't do it now, the planet that we are going to be leaving to our children and grandchildren may very well be uninhabitable and in much worse shape than the planet is today. We have a moral obligation to move aggressively to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy, and that is what my legislation does. So you want to talk about being frightened? I am frightened about the planet we're going to leave our kids if we don't act.
All right, Senator.
Now, actually, that may be the most important clip I show in the entire broadcast tonight, even though most of these clips are focused on these two crazy people in San Bernardino, California, who shot up a holiday party for the San Bernardino County Department of Public Health, which, 14 people were killed and another, 21 people were injured. And it is definitely a tragedy, and it has huge political implications, which is why it got covered so extensively. But in terms of the long-term impact on humanity, it's nothing compared to climate change, which even if we stick to the agreement that they say is going to come out of this Paris conference, it's not going to stop the temperature of the Earth from rising 2 degrees Celsius, which is what they were saying was going to be so dangerous. And maybe we'll be able to slow down before we get to 4 degrees Celsius, but there's already going to be some significant impact of climate change. And what Bernie Sanders said there about the carbon tax, I think that is really the most rational, reasonable way to fight climate change, is by putting a cost directly on carbon by taxing it where it appears in products. We're talking about basically as an addition to the gasoline tax, to coal, to, all the carbon impact of various products, and you add that to the cost of the product so that then the market will favor, people will want to get cheaper products that don't have so much of a carbon impact if the carbon is actually priced into the product. That is the way you use the free market in a much more efficient way, a much better way than this whole old Republican idea of the cap and trade system, where one polluter gets to pay another polluter so they can pollute more because the other polluter is going to pollute less. And it's just not as efficient and direct as a carbon tax. And so I definitely agree with what Bernie Sanders said there. And like I said, that's the last clip on the Democratic side of the 2016 presidential race. So the rest of the clips then are on the Republican side, which is much more comical, I guess, just in what the Republicans are saying in the clips I'm going to show. But I'm also going to start off with a little bit of political comedy from last night's Saturday Night Live. This is Colin Jost on Weekend Update making fun of Dr. Ben Carson, who's been plummeting in the polls, as I'll show in some subsequent clips. But this is Saturday Night Live making fun of Ben Carson's trip to Jordan that I covered in clips that I showed on the Sunday live clip roundup last week. Here's how Saturday Night Live made fun of it here.
Ben Carson this week toured refugee camps in Jordan and said that most of the Syrians he met there don't want to come to the U.S. It's a decision they made after asking Carson, "Where are you from?"
I actually thought that was kind of funny, and I was criticizing Saturday Night Live a couple weeks ago for not really having anything funny, and I criticized Saturday Night Live earlier in the program for not really having that great an analysis of the San Bernardino shooting, although that's kind of a difficult thing to analyze in a comedic way on a program like Saturday Night Live. But I thought that was kind of a funny joke from Colin Jost on Weekend Update, and it's also kind of gratifying that Dr. Ben Carson has dropped in the polls even amongst Republican voters, and that was covered by Dr. Ben Carson's good friend Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday. At one point in the broadcast, he talks about being a friend of Ben Carson. I can't remember if it's in one of the two clips I'm about to show, but this first clip does talk about how Ben Carson's dropping in the polls because foreign policy has become a big issue. Oh, and it starts with kind of a little Fox News joke about climate change. Chris Wallace joking about how we can begin that debate, and then, of course, Fox News didn't even mention climate change. This is the only mention of climate change on Fox News Sunday this morning in this little, throwaway line before introducing Ben Carson, talking about whether he knows anything about foreign policy, and his answer doesn't give me a lot of confidence. You can let me know what you think after you watch that clip here.
A look outside the Beltway at Buffalo, New York. Snowless this time of year for the first time since 1899. Let the climate change debate begin. 1 month ago, Dr. Ben Carson was riding high in the polls in a virtual tie with GOP frontrunner Donald Trump. But after terror attacks overseas and at home, Carson's poll numbers have dropped amid growing doubts about his readiness to be commander-in-chief. Joining me now is presidential candidate Dr. Ben Carson, and welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you, Chris.
If you were addressing the nation tonight, if it was President Carson, what would you tell the American people, and how would you say you're going to keep this country safe?
Well, I would say, first of all, that traditionally our unity has been our strength, and we have to stop listening to the purveyors of division and hatred and recognize that. I would also say that we are a very exceptional people. And you look at what we've done in the past. You know, we declared our independence in 1776. In less than 100 years, we're the #1 economic power in the world. And look at the positive influences that we've had throughout the world since that time. So now is not a time for fear, but a time for rational thought processing. As far as the radical Islamic jihadist terrorists are concerned, we need not kowtow to them. This is America. And we need to have a definitive and powerful strategy to defeat them, which will include understanding how they work and why they have been successful, and then attacking those things. You know, for instance, having established a caliphate, how do we take that away from them? Where do they get their money from? We have to take that away from them. Their ability to transfer money, we have to take that away from them. And, you know, looking at where their command central headquarters is, in Raqqa. You know, there are 4 ways in and out of Raqqa. We need to take advantage of being able to shut those off and, you know, create difficulty for them. And when they flee from there, we chase them to wherever else they go. And we keep them on the run, and
Dr.
we
Carson,
fight them. You know, that's what we do.
Well, he knows there are 4 ways in and out of Raqqa, but that really wasn't the question that Chris Wallace asked him. He kind of went to the facts that he's learned. He's learned some facts, but they don't always apply to the question, or they're sort of tangential to the question, I guess. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The worst of it was this speech he gave earlier in the week to I think it's the Jewish Republican Conference, the JRC or something like that. And he, first of all, as you'll see in the introduction from Chris Wallace, this is his good friend Chris Wallace, who actually asks a fairly confrontational question here. Chris Wallace asked him about why he was the only candidate who read his speech from prepared written remarks. And Chris Wallace doesn't actually say how he mispronounced the organization Hamas, but what a lot of people were saying is he called Hamas hummus, you know, the dip made out of chickpeas, hummus. He called Hamas hummus. You can sort of, I don't know, he may have just put the accent on the wrong syllable, so he said hummus instead of Hamas. But there, you can see that clip, and then his response is, well, it's more about substance than style, and you just wait and see. But I don't think he really has the substance either. You can let me know what you think after you watch that last clip of Dr. Ben Carson from Fox News Sunday this morning here.
Whether it's fair or not. You spoke this week before the Republican Jewish Coalition, and here's how it began.
I normally am a spontaneous speaker, but I want to make sure I get all my points in today, so I will actually be using a script.
You then read from prepared remarks for half an hour. You were the only candidate who didn't take any questions. And then there was this.
Fatah and Hamas operate in a constant state of conflict. Fatah rules the West Bank, Hamas rules the Gaza Strip.
Afterwards, Ari Fleischer, who's a member of the RJC board and, of course, was former Bush Press 43 press secretary, he tweeted this: "Someone should have told him how to pronounce Hamas. He sounds like he's not familiar with the group." Question: how do you respond? And you've read it over the last couple of days. How do you respond to all the criticism of your speech, sir?
Well, I expect everything that I say to be criticized. There were also some very positive remarks about it. I don't expect anybody to hear about that. You know, we need to get to the point where we start looking at the substance of what is being said, not the style in which it is being said. You know, that's a sign of maturity. And I actually believe that the people of this country are going to recognize that. They know what has happened traditionally when people try to manipulate everything and steer the conversation in their direction and try to manipulate people's opinions. But, you know, all I have to say is let's wait and see.
I have always been told, and
So that's Dr. Ben Carson's response, which I think I criticized before I showed it. It, I think, shows that his foreign policy knowledge has not really increased that much, and his drop in the polls, he's probably going to be replaced by some other person who can out-Christian Donald Trump, if possible, in Iowa. That's basically the big threat to Donald Trump, is that someone will be more appealing to the Christian evangelicals in Iowa, and then there's this big special evangelical primary or Southern primary that comes up in March, even if they don't do that well in New Hampshire in February. And anyway, that's one strategy that someone like Ted Cruz might do well in if Dr. Ben Carson's not going to do so well. But I want to go to the first two clips, or to the only two clips, I should say, I have of Donald Trump for the program tonight. The first one actually is just like one word from Donald Trump. He was supposed to be on State of the Union on CNN with Jake Tapper, but they had some problem. They do the show live at 6 a.m., so you'll see the problem occur by the 9 a.m. show, or 9 a.m. Pacific time for me. They had totally cut out the Donald Trump interview, but here's how Jake Tapper started the show, saying the State of the Union was tense, and then he showed this clip of Donald Trump, which is pretty inflammatory, and tried to get Donald Trump to talk about it, but then had technical problems, and I'll discuss the inflammatory statement after you watch that State of the Union clip from CNN this morning here.
In Washington, where the state of our union is tense, President Obama will address the nation from the Oval Office at 8 p.m. Eastern this evening, hoping to calm some of the fears that many Americans are feeling in the wake of the terrorist massacre in San Bernardino, California, carried out by an ISIS-inspired couple. And news of a shocking new attack in London. A man stabbed 3 people inside a tube station. Police there are calling it an act of terror. A new CNN poll shows Donald Trump is considered the candidate Republican voters most trust to handle the terrorist threat and ISIS. He has a runaway lead, topping the pack in our new CNN ORC poll with a new high of 36%. His closest rival is now Senator Ted Cruz, who follows far behind at 16%. Trump has been talking about the attack in San Bernardino on the campaign trail.
It turns out probably was related. Radical Islamic terrorism. And I'll tell you what, we have a president that refuses to use the term. He refuses to say it. There's something going on with him that we don't know about.
Joining me on the phone is Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. And as you heard in our intro, his voice is a little hoarse. How are you doing this morning, Mr. Trump? Mr. Trump? Is he there?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. You sound awful. We'll make this we'll make this short. You said to the Republican Jewish Coalition that there's something wrong with President Obama. What are you suggesting is wrong with him? We're having a problem with our connection with Mr. Trump, who obviously is experiencing his own set of technical difficulties with his throat this morning. We also wanted to talk to Senator.
So yeah, that was the technical difficulties on State of the Union, but that clip, I don't think Trump actually said there was something wrong with Obama, just like the implication was that Obama is some sort of secret Muslim, I think, is what I took from it, but I don't think the paraphrase from Jake Tapper was exactly right. You can click back and check it out yourself. I can't remember what the exact word. That's one of the masterful things Donald Trump is able to do, I think, to use inflammatory language, but then it sort of like almost disappears when you go back and look at it. You know, even like I remember one of the first things that was supposed to sink his campaign was when he went after John McCain. You know, he's not a war hero. He is a war hero. He's a war hero for being caught. So he never said he wasn't a war hero. He said he's not a war hero. He is a war hero. You know, he always like does this weird kind of verbal waffling where he never really says exactly what you thought he said, but he did really say it if you were listening when he said it at the time, if that makes any sense. But you can go back and look at what he said. It's one of those weird little Donald Trump waffles that he's saying that President Obama is actually a secret Muslim, but he never really said that. He never really said anything. But now I'm going to show one more clip from Donald Trump where he does kind of emphasize something he said before about going after the families of the ISIS terrorists, which I don't know. I think that may be a violation of the law of war and the Geneva Convention. Is going after non-combatants. That's kind of what separates us from terrorists, isn't it? That we don't go after the non-combatants, but he justifies it by saying, you know, the wives of the terrorists who took down the towers on 9/11 knew that it was going to happen and they got them out of the country. Or I don't even know what he's talking about, but he has some justification for the whole thing, and he then blends it into the San Bernardino attacks and how he doesn't believe the family and they must have known about it. Or though now it seems like the father of Syed Farook actually did know that he was an ISIS sympathizer, but most of the rest of the family has said they were shocked and didn't know anything like this was going to happen. But Donald Trump wants to go after the families, as you can see in this last I promised clip of Donald Trump from for tonight over here.
Big problem. I'm not playing on fears. I'm playing on common sense. We have a problem. The World Trade Center came down. And by the way, speaking of coming down, they put their families on airplanes a couple of days before, sent them back to Saudi Arabia for the most part. Those wives knew exactly what was going to happen. And those wives went home to watch their husbands knock down the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and wherever the third plane was going, except we had some very, very brave passengers wherever that third plane was going. Those wives knew exactly what was happening.
Yeah, you mentioned the families, going after the families. What does that mean? How
Well,
would
I
that
would
work?
go after, well, at least I would certainly go after the wives who absolutely knew what was happening. And I guess your definition of what I do, I'm going to leave that to your imagination. But I will tell you, I would be very tough on families because the families know what's happening. Even in this last instance, I see everybody knew. So many people knew. They thought that this man and this woman, you know, whether he was radicalized or how he became, they thought something was going on. Why don't these people report it to the police? Why wouldn't they report it to the police? Now, they said it was profile. They didn't want to profile. Can you believe this? They didn't want to profile, even though they thought something very bad was going on.
His sister said she didn't know what was going on. She was crestfallen for the victims here.
I probably don't believe the sister.
You don't believe the sister. So you'd go after her?
I would go after a lot of people, and I'd find out whether or not they knew. I'd be able to find out. because I don't believe the sister.
And do you worry about creating more terrorists?
No, we have to stop terrorists. And the only way you're going to stop them, in my opinion, is that way. You know, they say they don't mind dying. I think they do mind dying. But I can tell you this, they want their families left alone. We have to stop terrorism.
You don't think there's a worry, a tension if you go too far that you end up creating more terrorists?
What's too far? What's too far? They're killing people. Whether it's what we just saw in California or in Paris, they're killing people, innocent people, people without guns. You look at Paris, no guns, nothing. And you look at California, no guns. I can tell you one thing, if I'm in there and if I had a gun, we're going down shooting. We're going to knock them out, okay, one way or the other. And if a couple of guns are in that room, you talk about Second Amendment, which I'm a big believer in the Second Amendment. In Paris, they had no guns. In California, they had no guns. Only the bad guys had the guns. So they were like sitting ducks, every one of them.
Should the good guys get guns?
I couldn't go any further than that. That was over 2 minutes of Donald Trump, and there was quite a bit of bullshit in that answer, I thought, especially about taking out the families, and it doesn't cause more terrorists, and he would be much more tough on the families, even in this last San Bernardino shooting. I don't know what that's all about, but maybe you disagree with me. You can tell me what you think down in the comment section. I'm going to show another Republican candidate who's not doing very well. This is Ohio Governor John Kasich, who doesn't seem to be getting much traction, but I suppose there's time for that to switch around. He responds to what Donald Trump said about taking out the families by disagreeing with that and being reasonable on that, but then he has his whole other brand of different Republican bullshit on the topic of we have to get rid of the encryption that they're using. You know, he seems to say that they used encryption in Paris, which there's no real evidence that they did, or maybe they used encryption in this latest attack, and he has all this like surveillance that he wants to do that really wouldn't help the situation either, and is about as unhelpful as what you heard from Donald Trump, but is at least not as inflammatory. Seems presented in a much nicer way from Ohio Governor John Kasich, appearing on CNN's State of the Union, talking to Jake Tapper here.
Jake Tapper, the family of the couple who killed 14 people in San Bernardino, California this week, claims they had no idea what the terrorists were plotting. Donald Trump says he doesn't buy it, and he has called for more monitoring.
We have to start looking at families now. We have to look at them very, very tough. I think his mother knew what was going on. She went into the apartment. Anybody that went into that house or that apartment knew what was going on. We better get a little tough and a little smart, or we're in trouble.
Joining me now is Republican presidential candidate and Ohio Governor John Kasich. Governor Kasich, thanks so much for joining us. So Donald Trump, the frontrunner of the Republican Party, says that he's not ruling out a database of Muslims. He says when it comes to going after ISIS, we should take out their families. Should this be the national security policy of the Republican Party?
I don't think so, Jake. In terms of the families, look, we have these counterterrorism task forces across this country headed by the FBI. And I trust the intelligence community. They need more tools. I mean, Jake, one of the problems that we have is these folks have been able to encrypt their messages. We know that that was the case in Paris, and we suspect it's the case here. In other words, they can communicate, and our intelligence community, intelligence authorities, cannot see those communications. This is really troubling. This is the issue of encryption. And in order to solve that, that problem is going to have to be solved by the technology companies, the government. We're going to have to get together, because if, in fact, our intelligence community cannot see what's going on, cannot understand the communications, then we're operating in the dark. And look, we have a counterterrorism task force right here in Ohio. They're spread across the country. We work with them. It includes local law enforcement, and they have to have the tools that they need in order to be effective. But to say that somebody knew something or whatever, we have to rely on the intelligence community to draw their conclusions and do their investigations.
Is there any evidence that encryption played a role in this attack? In the Paris attacks just recently, we heard the same call for encryption technology to be released to the intelligence community, and it seems as though the terrorists there were communicating on Facebook. They were basically hiding in plain sight.
Well, I think a lot of it, Jake, from the intelligence people I talk to, the ones that I'm familiar with here in our state, is basically the fact that these two out in California may have been communicating, but they may have, as they say, have gone dark. In other words, I know that there were people being monitored who they were in touch with, but we also know that this couple had not been identified. So, no, I think the issue of encryption is for real. It is serious. And the Congress needs to get on it because we're going to require a national solution. But look, let's just go back to one other thing that I think is critical. I don't believe that we can defeat ISIS just from the air, and I don't think we can rely on just other people to take care of that job. I believe the United States should be leading an effort right now to assemble a coalition just like we saw in the first Gulf War. And I remember when the ambassador from Egypt to the United States stood in the Rose Garden and pledged support. And we were able to drive Saddam out of Kuwait. That was a serious matter. This is a much more serious matter, and we should be using everything we can to assemble a coalition of the West and our friends in the Middle East, and we need to go and destroy ISIS where they are. And then, Jake, you know, I've also talked about the battle of ideas, and we're increasingly beginning to wonder about why people affiliate with ISIS. You know, when people have no meaning in their lives, they begin to do things that sometimes can be totally crazy. And so I believe that the West, along with our moderate Muslim friends, need to communicate that we're about civilization, we're about life, those kinds of things, but immediately destroy ISIS in a coalition on the ground. You mark my words, we will ultimately have to do it. And the longer we wait, the more complicated and the more costly it will be.
Your campaign...
So there's a guy who's not going to be the Republican nominee unless things radically change from the way they are right now. And like I said, what he said about encryption is something that people at the NSA are really in favor of, which is making these tech companies put back doors into all their encryption systems so that government can spy on anyone they want to, or can spy on people they get a warrant to spy on, which is kind of what John Kasich, I think, was saying. But the ridiculous part of it is what Jake Tapper at least had the integrity to call him on there, was that there really wasn't any evidence of encryption in this latest incident at all. He said they weren't on anyone's radar, so that means they went dark. But no, they didn't go dark, and apparently they just weren't... didn't have any kind of record, and they weren't trying to get caught till they actually decided to go ahead with the attack, which is, you know, this Facebook post from the wife apparently came just a few minutes before the attack started, and that's really the only public indication that they were going to do anything. I mean, they didn't go dark. They just were a husband and wife team who wasn't really talking to anyone of any high level in ISIS or anyone else. That's at least what the facts are at this point. And the Paris attacks also, there isn't that much evidence of encryption. That's just like one of these stories floated by people who want to get the tech companies to make it easier for the government to listen in on our encrypted conversations. At least that's my opinion. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. I'm going to actually show one more clip on reaction to Donald Trump. This is a news story on NBC's Meet the Press that Chuck Todd talked about, that the establishment Republicans are all worried that Trump is actually going to be their nominee, and they put out a memo about how Republicans can run with a crazy person as their nominee, basically, and how Trump has responded to that memo, or reports of that memo, over in this clip.
To dominate the 2016 field, the Republican establishment's low-grade anxiety is becoming an all-out panic. In a CNN poll out this week, but conducted before the San Bernardino shootings, Trump led the field with 36%, 20 points ahead of his nearest rival, Ted Cruz. Ben Carson has slipped down to 14. In case you're keeping track of this, Jeb Bush is down to 3%. Now, the establishment Republicans are beginning to say on the record what they had been whispering about in private for months, that Donald Trump at the top of the ticket could mean an electoral wipeout down the ballot. And Republicans are taking the possibility of Trump as nominee seriously enough that the committee that oversees next year's Senate races laid out a confidential 7-page blueprint for candidates on how to run with Trump at the top of the ticket. For instance, advising candidates to, quote, grab onto the best elements of his anti-Washington populist agenda, but warning that Trump is a misguided missile, subject to farcical fits, and candidates should avoid getting drawn into, quote, every Trump dust-up, but should quickly condemn some of his comments, including wacky things about women. Well, Trump responded to the memo on Thursday.
I don't say anything wacky about women. I have more respect for women than anybody would understand, and I'm going to get people jobs, and I'm going to protect people. And that's why every time there's a tragedy, everything goes up, my numbers go way up.
Panelists here, of course, Rich Lauer.
I guess Trump is great on women. Women love Donald Trump, but I think he does have a pretty big gender gap. But like I said, also, that is the last Donald Trump clip I want to show for my coverage of the Republican side of the 2016 presidential race. Now I'm going to have 4 more clips from 4 more candidates after I show a little news summary from NBC's Meet the Press. Chuck Todd talking about how Republicans have responded to this gun issue. First, talking about the New York Times editorial that was in that previous clip I showed, but here's how it was covered on Meet the Press. First, the New York Times editorial, and then how various Republicans have responded to the raising of the gun issue with this latest San Bernardino shooting over here.
Gun control was reignited after the San Bernardino attack. The New York Times ran its first front-page editorial in 95 years, calling for greater gun regulation, and publications from around the country also weighed in, as you can see here. Now, on the other side of this debate, Republican presidential contenders didn't hold back when it came to the issue of guns.
If you look at Paris, they didn't have guns, and they were slaughtered. If you look at what happened in California, they didn't have guns, they were slaughtered. They could have protected themselves if they had guns.
They're still out there talking about gun control measures, as if somehow terrorists care about what our gun laws are.
Folks in the media ask at the behest of Democrats, isn't it insensitive for us to do a Second Amendment rally following this terror attack? Let me tell you something. I really don't view our job as being sensitive to Islamic terrorists.
Well, Elizabeth, it was your...
Now, well, I don't have a clip of Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz hasn't done a Sunday morning interview for quite a while. I guess it's part of his anti-establishment cachet, but I do have a couple Republican candidates, one who is increasingly viable, apparently, Marco Rubio, and one who is increasingly non-viable, Jeb Bush, both talking about this gun issue and specifically whether the no-fly list should, if you're on the no-fly list that stops you from getting on an airplane, if that should stop you from getting on a gun. And you heard earlier that Hillary Clinton thinks that that is perfectly reasonable, that there are due process, there's due process for the no-fly list, which I'm kind of dubious about. And like I said, I kind of agree with what some of the Republicans are saying about the lack of due process on the no-fly list, although I don't agree with them that there's no way to make guns less accessible to people who shouldn't have guns. But anyway, here's Marco Rubio addressing that issue, talking to Jake Tapper on CNN's State of the Union this morning here.
How does this proactive approach, when it comes to having people on your radar in terms of the U.S. government looking for terrorists, how does it square with the fact that on Thursday, the day after the attack in San Bernardino, you and every Republican in the Senate voted no, except for Mark Kirk, I should point out, you and almost every Republican in the Senate voted no on legislation that would have kept people on terrorist watch lists from being able to purchase firearms or explosives. President Obama calls it insane that people on the no-fly list can walk in and buy explosives or a gun.
Because the majority of the people on the no-fly list are oftentimes people that basically just have the same name as somebody else who don't belong on the no-fly list. Former Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, once said he was on a no-fly list. I mean, there are journalists on the no-fly list. There are others involved in the no-fly list that wind up there. These are everyday Americans that have nothing to do with terrorism. They wind up on the no-fly list. There's no due process or any way to get your name removed from it in a timely fashion. And now they're having their Second Amendment right being impeded upon. If these were perfect lists, that would be one thing. But there are over 700,000 Americans on some watch list or another that would all be captured under this amendment the Democrats offered. And that's the problem. There aren't 700,000 terrorists operating in America openly on watch lists. They include vast numbers of Americans who have names similar to someone we're looking for. Sometimes you're only on that list because the FBI wants to talk to you about someone you know, not because you're a suspect. And again, now your Second Amendment right is being impeded with.
I don't think it's accurate to say that a majority of them are on the list by accident, but let me...
A very significant number of people on those lists are on there because they have names similar to somebody else. My office deals with dozens of calls every year from people that are on no-fly lists or identified lists of watch lists. It's not just a no-fly list.
So these watch lists should just be ignored?
No, they shouldn't be ignored, but they shouldn't be used as a tool to impede 700,000 Americans or potential people on that list from having access to being able to fully utilize their Second Amendment rights. There are many people on no-fly lists that are not terrorists, not just no-fly lists, I apologize, on any of these terror watch lists, because that amendment was not just limited to the no-fly list. That is not a perfect database, and it has a significant number of errors.
Senator Marco Rubio, thanks so much for joining us, and please wish your wife happy birthday for us.
Thank you.
Coming up, President Obama says it's insane that you could be on a terror watch list, unable to board a plane, and you can still buy explosives or firearms, but Republicans disagree. We'll have much more on that coming.
I like the way Jake Tapper both started and ended that clip with the quote of President Obama saying that it's insane that if you're on the terrorist watch list, you can still buy guns or an explosive. If that was over on Fox News, I'd say they were using primacy and recency to emphasize the Obama talking point on that. And I actually agree a little bit with the Republicans on this particular issue because, like I said, I think there are some due process problems with the way people get on these no-fly lists. I'm not familiar with all of the terrorist watch lists. That is a little bit disturbing that there are such lists, but there should be some way for people to find out that they're on the list and get off the list if it has some actual implications for what they're allowed to do. Although I can't remember, there was someone on one of the programs was saying that we can't stop them from buying guns because then they'll know they're on the watch list. I can't remember. That's not one of the clips I took, but the next clip is actually Jeb Bush, who is also talking about the problems with terrorist watch lists. But then he also won't accept the fact that that means that people who swear allegiance to ISIS might be able to get guns. He is very much a candidate who wants to have his cake and eat it too on the issue, I guess, is the best way to describe it. And that's in his interview with George Stephanopoulos on ABC's This Week This Morning over here.
The no-fly list. Do you believe that people on the no-fly list should be able to buy guns?
You mean Ted Kennedy and Stephen Hayes, the journalist, and Cat Stevens? I mean, this is not a list that you can be certain of. The first impulse of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama is to have gun control. What the first impulse in my mind is, let's have a strategy to take out ISIS there so we don't have to deal with it here.
But as the Democratic leader, Harry Reid, pointed out this week that the FBI terror suspects now who pledge allegiance to ISIS can still buy guns in America. Is that okay with you?
I don't think it's appropriate if they haven't, if we're tracking them, and if the FBI knows that someone's in our country and they're tracking them, they shouldn't be able to get guns, for sure. But the no-fly list is a much broader list. It's not an accurate list to be able to use for restricting gun rights for law-abiding citizens.
But so you're saying that if the list were more refined, then you would be?
Yeah, I mean, if you're tracking someone who you believe may be a terrorist, of course they shouldn't get guns. The FBI has that capability right now.
But right now, according to the law, someone could pledge allegiance to ISIS, and that wouldn't necessarily be disqualifying.
It should be, and I think it is. I think if the FBI is aware of, if they're tracking someone, they have the ability to look and see, and they're notified when someone tries to purchase a gun.
You also heard Secretary...
So that's Jeb Bush saying some things I agree with about the lack of due process on the no-fly list, but then trying to have it both ways by saying that somehow he's going to stop people who pledge allegiance to ISIS from getting guns anyway. I don't think his candidacy is going anywhere, but stranger things have happened in politics, I guess. And on the topic of stranger things have happened, I have two more candidates on the Republican side I want to show who have very little chance of being the nominee, but are in the stranger things have happened category, I guess. It's Senator Rand Paul and Senator Lindsey Graham. First, this is Rand Paul talking about the way Marco Rubio has attacked him for being against NSA spying or bulk phone record collection. And there's been this AP story that came out that said that the San Bernardino shooters, we can only find their phone records for the last 2 years instead of 5 years like we would have under the old bulk phone record collection. Like, that makes a big difference, or like 10 years worth of phone records wouldn't have stopped this attack. It was like totally not the kind of thing that could have been discovered through bulk phone record collection. And maybe even after the fact, there's not any real information. And as Rand Paul points out in his answer here, there's no evidence that bulk phone record collection has ever really stopped a terrorist attack. But here's from both these last clips are from NBC's Meet the Press. Chuck Todd asks him about Marco Rubio's attack on him on this issue, and here's his answer here.
Get you to respond to something Marco Rubio said. He just said the following: a week ago, we were still able to see the phone records of a potential terrorist cause. We held them. Now you have to hope the phone company still has them. You have to argue with their chief counsel by the time you get access to it and try to find out who they've been talking to before it's too late. You were on the forefront of trying to change this law. Any second thoughts?
Well, you know, if Senator Rubio were doing his job and in Congress more, he might know that the program continues. It's been ongoing for the last 6 months. So the Paris tragedy, this tragedy, happened while we were still doing bulk collection, all bulk collection. Also in France, they have a program 1,000-fold more invasive, collecting all of the data of all the French. And yet they still weren't able to see this coming. So my question is, how much liberty do we want to give up for a false sense of security? The government has investigated our program of collecting through a generalized fashion everyone's phone records in the country, and they've found that no terrorist case has been thwarted through this.
What will you do?
So that's an important fact you don't hear a lot on the corporate news media. Rand Paul's one of the few people who is bringing that fact forward, that no terrorist attack has ever been thwarted by this bulk phone record collection. I covered that through clips several months back, where I think the report showed that there was one there was like one transfer of like $10,000 that was thwarted through bulk phone record collection. And they've tried to play that up, like, you know, that could have been a really big terrorist attack, that $10,000, but that's the best they can do in terms of any attacks that have been thwarted by bulk phone record collection. So even though Rand Paul is not someone I think I would ever vote for, unless I had to choose between the Republican candidates, maybe he would end up being my vote, as I talked about several months back. But someone who I don't think I could ever vote for is Senator Lindsey Graham, the last clip I'm going to show you tonight. And this is just I don't know, it's not really political comedy, but it's just typical Lindsey Graham, where he always, you know, even on weeks like this where there are actually people killed in the United States by people who apparently have pledged allegiance to ISIS, he still can blow the threat out of proportion and just get overheated on the topic. I think in this clip he actually says that we're about to that we're going to experience another 9/11. That's the gist of the clip. Also from NBC's Meet the Press. Final clip for the broadcast tonight here.
It seems as if you can militarily take care of an Al-Qaeda. You can militarily take care of an ISIS. We haven't defeated the ideology. The ideology is as strong as ever, given what just happened in San Bernardino. What is your plan to defeat the ideology, sir?
Well, you start with the leaders of the you take down the caliphate. I'm convinced that the caliphate, the size of Indiana, if it were destroyed, it'd be harder for people to be recruited.
But we took down Al-Qaeda, and this just rose up, a new version of this, a new strain rose up.
I can tell you this, that Al-Qaeda has been placed on the run but not destroyed. ISIL is not the JV team. I cannot stress enough that there's a terrorist army in Syria and Iraq that wants to attack the homeland, and we're not doing anything about it. So how do you defeat the ideology? You build up others. You reject Rand Paul. This flirtation with isolationism in the Republican Party is over. It's giving way to a more muscular foreign policy that I've been advocating. But I'm also advocating building up others. Build a small schoolhouse in Afghanistan to help a poor young girl have a say about her children will destroy the ideology more than a bomb. I'm a internationalist. I want to help others, not just kill terrorists. But I can tell you there's a sense of urgency that the president does not possess, that there is a 9/11 in the making. I've just came back from Iraq. It is a matter of time till we get hit by ISIL, not some lone wolf attack, but hardened terrorists who are coming here to hit us hard if we don't hit them first.
What more, are there more reasons?
I don't know. I think he may have used the word hard too many times in the end of that statement. And I think, is it blowing things out of proportion to say there's another 9/11 on the way, that it's about to happen, or whatever it was he just said there? You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. That's the last clip I have for you for the broadcast tonight. I hope you enjoyed the selection of clips I picked out. I think it was 29 clips from the Sunday morning news analysis programs, Saturday Night Live, and then the 2 clips from President Obama. If you would like to help support my weekly program, you can give a direct donation through this little eye up in the left-hand corner here. If you click right there with your mouse, there is fan funding on YouTube, or down in the video description, I have a link to my Patreon page where you can join my 50-plus patrons who pledge about $330-something a month at this point. I was hoping to get that up to about $400 a month. If some of you might be able to help me without, no starving students, please. But if you enjoy these broadcasts and you want me to be able to keep doing it through 2016, and you want me able to justify the use of my time every Sunday, it takes me about 8 or so hours before the broadcast to watch all the shows and prepare all the clips, and then the broadcast itself is a couple hours. So if you want to help support that, especially when I cover topics like this that may or may not be monetized because of YouTube's sensitive topic policy. So support me if you can, if you're comfortable doing that. And also this week I'm hoping to put out an edited, produced video I've been working on. I wish I had already finished it. It's called War on Christmas Caused San Bernardino Shooting. It's based on some Fox News clips and actually one MSNBC clip and some tweets from Laura Ingraham on some initial take on the shooting at this holiday party in San Bernardino about, excuse me, about whether it was a literal war on Christmas attack. Hopefully I'll be able to finish that up in 1 or 2 days. Anyway, if you want to see that, if you think it's worth finishing, let me know in the comment section. Other than that, I know I'll be back next Sunday at 6:30, or no, probably 6 p.m. Pacific time, who knows. Right around that time, that's when the show has generally been starting, and hopefully I'll have some other video during the week, and if not, I'll just see you all back next week, 6 p.m. Pacific time, Greenwich Mean Time minus 8 hours, and until then, I guess I'll be seeing all of you around the internet.